record to the cloud. So this is now recording. All right. A couple other things I should have got ready first off. All right. So we're pretty much getting to the end of our Thursday lunchtime topic of going through the advanced data modeling class from Microsoft. So we have module 6. There's a lot in here, but a lot of it is really just review. So it could be kind of review, and if you have questions while we're going through the review, we could answer them and then see how long that takes us. There is a lot of slides, but again, it's whatever's going to help everybody. And I think we have this scheduled again for next week, which will be kind of just further wrap up. There's very little in module 7. It's more just kind of a Q&A type of thing. So if we don't make it through all of module 6, we'll have next week to kind of wrap everything up. The other thing that we're trying to look at is, you know, I think a lot of people have gotten a lot out of these weekly lunchtime sessions. You know, we'd probably want to go ahead and keep them going. You know, so what's kind of a next topic? You know, think about that, and if you could either put it into the chat if you think of it, or think of it for maybe next session, and we could start trying to come up with another topic. That might start after Memorial Day or something like that, and we'll see how the summer kind of goes. But especially if people are going to start doing vacations again and stuff like that. I know I have one. So anyways, our Slack group, let me see what I have up on Slack right now. I could bring that up. So we have this Slack channel in our Slack group here called Advanced Data Analytics. We didn't have a meeting last week, so there was no new video put up there. Hopefully people weren't totally confused. I know I was out, and it sounded like some things kind of occurred. If you haven't joined this Slack channel yet, let me get the invite link, and I'll put it in the chat here. So yeah, feel free to join that and ask questions there, or have conversations with anybody. And without further ado, we'll get going. If you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. I'll have the chat up in another screen that I may or may not see. So others, if you see it on the chat, go ahead and interrupt me that there's something to do or something to look at. All right. So in this module, we're really going to talk about kind of some basics. Like I said, a lot of it's going to be review, things that were touched on throughout the course, but it's going to focus on it from more of a best practice standpoint, and stating a lot of the slides when I looked over them this morning to remind myself, they are talking about, you know, what the best practice is and a little bit of why. And I'll try to expand on what I've seen from my experience as well, on why you want to do these best practice approaches. Okay, so from data modeling, right? You know, you want to make sure that you model correctly so you don't have an inefficient model. We'll see in another slide coming up. Let me take a drink, sorry. Right, we'll see in another slide, and as we talk a lot about in data modeling, the STAR schema is the best approach. Reduce things down. You know, that's going to help you. As a matter of fact, Adam from Guy in a Cube, I just watched this while I was eating my breakfast/lunch. Today, he just released another video that went through his checklist on ways that he handles going through troubleshooting a model. So if you go through Adam's last 2 videos, he talks about the external tools he used, and then today he talked about how he uses them in a checklist he goes through and where he finds things to help out. So that's just kind of added, that's outside of this course here. But you do want to make your model as small as possible, right? The less memory you could take up, the better. There are some reasons to bend this rule. I know there's times where I run into performance issues with some very heavy DAX. that we might be calculating something out, that we go ahead and build a table that gets calculated at refresh time that really helps performance out, especially on something that we have that's being used by, 50 to 100 users a day. You don't want that to be slow. So there are reasons to bend that rule. Just number one, identify that it's slow, and then think of the right way of approaching it, and know that's why you have the exception. That the schema that you have, right, the star schema, the model that you have, it supports the analysis that you're looking for, right? If you're constantly having to derive more things out of DAX, especially in DAX measures, then you might need to change your model up a little bit. And use relationships. Have them purposely thought out, because they're going to help improve the speed. So this is talking about moving calculations back to the source. If you follow a lot of the guys from Microsoft, Matthew Roach, he's called his Twitter handle SQL Allfather. See if I can remember his statement. It's do the work as far upstream as possible and as far downstream as necessary, right? So, if you're hitting a SQL database source, right, you're always going to get better performance if you have your queries run up in the SQL database, right? Whether that's producing views, producing queries that you put into your for get data, and there's a way to actually make them foldable. We'll talk about folding later, or just some way that that it gets pushed back to the SQL Server, because typically those are machines, the servers that are well tuned for SQL Server, and DBAs do a lot of work to keep them up that way. They have indexes put on them. Next is if you can't do it there, can you do it in the Power Query in the mashup engine, right? Because that's built again for for better speed. Then last is if you need to actually build a column and you use a calculated column with DAX, that you might have a need to do it that way, but just know that if it can be pushed back to Power Query or even back to the source, it's going to compress better when it gets into Power BI, and so that's gonna help your model perform better. So those are all good things to kind of think about. Another good best practice. Remove unused tables and columns, and this doesn't say it, but also sometimes think about the rows that are in your tables as well, right? But starting with if you have tables that are coming into your model and you're not having any relationships to them, right? There is this concept called disconnected tables that have a very good purpose for helping you with visualizations. But if you're not using them for some reason, remove them from your model. They're just taking up memory that could be used for other purposes. It will increase the size of your model. Remember, the model up in the on the service in Pro is limited to 1 gig in memory, right? That doesn't mean that that's the size of the data uncompressed, but once it's compressed and it's sitting in memory, you're only going to be able to go up to 1 gig. Past that, you're going to have to go to some premium capacity. But also the refresh time gets increased because you're bringing things in that you're not using, and it may affect the usability. And then rows, right? If you think about aggregation tables, right? Can you aggregate things down so that you have a smaller number of rows? Or you're using those rows to figure out some other logic that you could do over in Power Query and then reduce that. Think about those type of things. A lot of times what you might see is people will connect to tables inside Power Query doing their load data, right? And then they may reference a table and generate another table off of that, or append 2 tables, and then that first table, they don't realize that they could say disable to uncheck the enable load, and that won't bring it into the Power BI side of the model, right? So that's less memory. It's still available in Power Query and in the mashup engine, but now that those intermediate tables not being brought into the model reduces the size of memory that you're using. So remember that as well.
Hey, Kevin, this is Amin. Yeah. I ask you a question.
Hey, yeah, sure.
So I remember you shared a video maybe like a couple months ago, but I don't remember where you can find like how much compression or what is the size. So like if you go and you say, maybe I don't need this, how much room is it taking up? I don't remember. How do you look at
that? Yeah, so the video I just talked about, that guy in a cube released today,
I'm
covers
sorry,
that.
I was late.
Oh, that's okay. you told us you had a morning meeting going long, so that's not a worry. But it's in the way you could get that is inside DAX Studio. When you connect to the model, there's a let's see, I don't have DAX Studio connected to anything right now. Oh, thanks. Somebody, I think, just put the link to that video out there. I'm not going to connect anything,
okay.
but
I'll look at that.
Under advanced, there's this, it'll be enabled, this view metrics when you're connected to a model, and you click on that and it'll produce you a report, and it'll show you every one of your columns, and it'll show the size and everything about it.
Great. Thank you guys so much.
Yep. So avoid high precision, high cardinality columns, right? Or model in a way to help with some of that. So the one, I'm going to skip down to the bottom of this slide if you're kind of reading through it. The one that I love to give as an example, and I just did this in one of my big models. It's not big. It's really only like 5,000 Salesforce opportunities that I split into multiple tables within my model, right? So it's not a lot of rows, but for what the business needs to see, I want to say there's like 10 dates that's in the model. And they actually want to, they need information about the date and the time. And if I kept all of that in one column, that's very high precision. And so it doesn't compress very well. But by separating the date and time into two different columns, I'm able to, number one, do better reporting on dates, right? Because I don't have to worry about the time portion of it. I could connect it to my date table pretty easily. So it gives me a lot of, much better functionality. And then where they need to see the time, I can display the time. And their other requirement was they wanted to see the date and the time together all in one cell. So we did that by reproducing the date time in a measure that is displayed out. And then that way we're not taking up the larger amount of memory, but still able to give the same functionality to the end users. So date time's a great example of this, right? It's got high precision, and so it doesn't compress well, right? Especially if you get down to seconds or in some places milliseconds or whatever, you're just not going to compress very well. You'll see things, floats are the same way, right? Because of the number of decimal precisions afterwards. So if you're working with currency, but your data source happens to keep it as a float, most times that working with any currency on a reporting thing, you don't need more than 4 decimal places. So you convert it to have that many number of decimal places inside memory that works as a decimal number. It's going to compress a whole lot better.
Wait, you can tell it how many decimal places on a floating point?
Well, what you do is you do your conversion, say in Power Query or in your actual source, like in a view, reading it from there, and you change the type to say that you're only going to have 4 precisions in the decimal point. Now that'll come in as a decimal number into Power BI, and compress a whole lot better than if it's a floating point.
Can you do, is that unique to currency? Is there any way to do that for other floating point data?
You do, yeah, you could do that for any floating point. Currency was just a good example. Sometimes you're working, it depends on how scientific you're getting with things, right? And sometimes you need to have a whole lot more precision, and then you have to stick with a float. But most business cases want that, what they'll work with is 2 to 4 decimal places.
Sure. And I guess I didn't realize I could limit that in Power Query. You're saying I can.
I would do the conversion in Power Query or in the, yeah, in the, you know, right, the transformation logic, bringing it into the model. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so that's kind of the two main ones that I see. High cardinality, you know, this is one, I'll get business requirements from somebody that says, I need on this to see the comments. And comments are going to be horrible at compression because they're going to have, the comments are probably going to be unique on every single row. And I'll always warn them, once we do this, we're going to have issues with, you know, how we're standing up the model, how much memory it's going to take, how it's going to perform, all of these type of things. But sometimes they're actually needed. Now, now that Microsoft has changed how they're licensing premium, I would probably solution their solution to that question a little bit differently. And if they can use premium or move up to premium, I would look at paginated reports and actually query back against the source to get that type of thing. So, but that's not what we're here for. Go ahead.
I was just asking. Just another question. So
sure.
Obviously, you know, if you have a table with comments, there's going to be, like you said, they're all unique, and its cardinality is going to be the same as the number of rows in the table. But that's also true for your key column. So is the point that when you have something like that, it's high cardinality, for example, a key column, then you want to make sure you have a really short, a really compact contents, you know, like the data. Is that really the point? Like to trade off, if you're going to have high cardinality, try and have it of really compact data items?
Yeah. So like a lot of times, actually, I got to research into something for this, but like I'll work with some data sources that their key is a unique identifier, also known as a GUID, right? And that's going to be stored and viewed in Power BI as a string. So that's not going to compress very well. But if I change it in the source I assign each GUID to an integer value, right? Or a large integer value, depending on the number of rows that you have. So let's say, because GUIDs are,
right. So
I don't remember how long they are, but let's say that they're 14 characters,
right?
Where that's 14 bytes, where an integer is going to be 4 bytes, I think.
Yeah. So, okay. So that's the point, is if my keys are kind of these long text strings, I should consider creating an index column. But isn't that only going to help me in the, because somewhere I need to map those are the keys that you're saying use that as my key for all across, like use that as the key. So like when I'm connecting to other tables, like that's the thing that,
yeah, you're gonna produce that key on the dimension table, and then you're also going to make sure you get that key on your fact table, so you can build your relationship off of that new index column. So you're taking some more time in your transform, right? Your ETL step, but you gain so much more time from your end user experience that it's usually well worth it.
Yeah, it makes sense. I just wasn't really thinking. I wasn't thinking about it well. So the key, obviously, it shows up everywhere. So you need to be as compact as possible. Yeah.
Exactly.
Kevin, I have a question related to that then, and I had to step away for a second, so maybe I missed it. But so I'm working with Salesforce, and I have the opportunity ID, and I use that to link to other tables. So I'm afraid to So basically I would take the opportunity ID, and before I do any other transformation, I would say, give me an index number for each of those. And then that will travel with it. Like, how will I connect to another table?
So on that other table that you're going to connect it to, you're going to have to join it back to that opportunity. So like the way that I end up doing it is I would have like the opportunity table just in its raw form, and I might add it. I would probably add an index column to it at that point, right? And then my dimension is going to reference that, and I'm going to choose the columns that I want. So I'm not bringing the opportunity ID over with it. And then my fact table, to whatever I'm producing that would normally have the opportunity ID GUID, I'm going to join back to that, what I'll call a staging table, right? The first one that has the index to it. I'm going to join it on that unique identifier, and I'm going to expand after that merge and just choose the index column ID, and then on that fact table get rid of the GUID as it might choose columns afterwards.
Okay.
So that your fact table just has the same key that your dimension table, and now that's going to be a whole lot smaller.
Okay, and so it'll just travel through, and then any new opportunities that are added are just going to get tacked on with a new index number anyhow.
Yeah, it travels through because of the way you're setting up your joins inside your transformation logic.
Okay.
Because you have one table that it gets assigned to, and then you're using that to merge, join to others in order to bring it across, right?
So it's almost like an alias.
Yeah.
Unique ID.
Yeah, in the data modeling world and in the IT world, a lot of people call it a surrogate key.
Okay.
And yeah, it uniquely identifies a row, but it has no meaning to anything, and it could change at any time.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
I say at any time, but it's really at model refresh time, right? So, okay.
Okay.
So this was kind of what we just even talked about, right? Is using integers instead of strings. So, and the reason that it's much more efficient for integers is because with strings, it's going to do the dictionary encoding. Where integers, they don't set up a dictionary in the way the what's called the Vertipack engine works. It just figures out a run length. So if on your fact table, you got all of those opportunities and it's all pointing to key one, what it keeps in the engine is I have key one, repeat it down for the next 10 rows, and then it's key two. And so that's how it achieves its compression ratio by what's doing a run length encoding rather than a dictionary encoding.
I mean, that only works in the table where they're in order, right? I'm confused. Like
the sorting does matter, exactly. And so that's why you'll hear a big answer of like, how much will this help with my compression? Because depending on how the data is sorted and then to get really technical, there's also what Power BI does is it works in segment chunks, right? And so it's what each segment looks like. And I think in a Power BI data set, each segment is 1 million rows, to where like in Azure Analysis Services uses the same technology, but its segment size is 8 million rows, right? So you get a different compression ratio because of all of that. But yes, all of that but these are best practices, right, to set up in order to help the engine to do that. You don't have any control over what the engine is going to do, but you could influence it by following these best practices.
Well, and it never occurred to me until you mentioned this, that I never thought about sorting my, coming out of Power Query, what does it matter how they're sorted? But from what you just said, I could think about sorting to try and anticipate the best compression. I mean, otherwise sorted doesn't mean a thing, right?
I think It's usually not a good step to put into that, because the engine might even do its own sorting to figure out what its
Okay,
its
gotcha.
right thing is. So
Okay,
that's usually unneeded, and it's just going to add on something that may or may not help the end. The Vertipact engine is very good at trying to figure out how to best do its compression, but it may decide to sort on a different key than what you decided on, because it thought, again, it's based upon how it does its sampling and everything else when it first starts it out, and then it goes ahead and builds it.
that's fair.
Yeah. Okay, see, so that right here. Oh, now here. Okay, so I guess this is gonna,
It's funny.
all right. It's, I guess I didn't say it right. I always see it as, what I've read a couple times is it says, don't worry about it. But I guess here it's saying pre-sort them. So if you can, I guess, but I think you have to guess correctly. So if you know, like, for example, you have a lot of repeats for an opportunity and you're making a surrogate key for it. I'm guessing if you sort it by that, you're going to help the engine out quite a bit. But
Do you know if it's in Power Query, there's an add key function where you can tell it what the key of the table is. Is that a direction where is that you basically telling Power Query like this, you know what I mean, for compression purposes?
Yeah, I don't know for sure. I haven't used that a whole lot, but it's something, because I know we've talked about it a couple times, and I've never taken the time.
I honestly, and I only did it desperately to try and make my merging faster, and I'm not really sure if it's working.
But I think in Power Query you would have to kind of click on the column and tell it to sort by it or something like that. So, and then it would actually insert a sort step.
No, and my point is, like, if I told it that column is the key, will that maybe give the compression engine direction?
I don't know, because remember what Power Query is doing and what the Power BI model, that the Vertipact engine, they are right. They're not 100% connected,
Okay.
right? One's feeding the other, but I don't know how much metadata it feeds across. Yeah, I'll probably need to write that one down and kind of look deeper into that. What is the impacts of that? So
just put it on what do they call that? The parking lot?
put it in that parking lot. But look, the one part I did get right is I got my millions correct, right? I think I said 8 million. And
you did.
I'll have to go back and listen to the audio to verify myself. Okay. Bidirectional relationships. I think we've talked about this earlier in the class as well. They have their purpose, which is why they exist, but, use sparingly and try to use other techniques before turning them on, right? Whether it's doing a cross join within some measure, or other type of things, because once it's turned on, and if somebody produces a report off of the model and they use it in a way you don't expect them to, there is some cases where the bidirectional relationship could give incorrect results. I say incorrect. I think the better term, because listen to the SQL BI guys, is unexpected results. It's correct based upon how everything put together, but it wasn't the result you really wanted it to be.
So do they have a video on how to take bidirectional and turn it into some other thing, like a cross join? I don't.
Yeah, the SQL BI guys would have all kinds of video. They've talked about that a few times.
Okay.
And I think it's in some of their YouTube older ones that they've talked about it. So yeah. And I know they bring it up in multiple cases. So the other thing is it could introduce, if there's multiple paths to something, it could introduce ambiguity. And that's the one, if you're going to search the SQL BI stuff, I would search for ambiguity, because that's where they're going to talk about the issues with bidirectional relationships. And it's when that it ends up producing more than one way of getting to a certain point. in the model. I don't remember all of it in my off the top of my head, but I just remember that's another problem with bidirectionals. Again, that a recent model that I put together, turned out to be the best way to model something out. Again, the number of rows in the model is kind of small, but we were running into some issues just the other day. And the first thing I wanted to eliminate is that the bidirectional filter wasn't causing that issue. Because anytime I have it in a model and I have problems, that's the first thing I start debugging, and I want to eliminate that as my problem. So, okay, so now this is going to get a little bit more towards the data model side than the Power Query side. So think about your, yeah, there it is, ambiguity. Russ found it. Thanks, Russ. Think about setting your default summarization. By default, summarization is set to sum, but you have columns inside, especially like those surrogate keys that we were talking about. When they come into the model, they're going to be set to a default summarization of sum. What I've noticed lately is as soon as you put a relationship against them, that goes to none anyways. But if you have other columns, you'll want to go in and set those to none. And Power BI desktop itself has done a whole lot to improve the modeling experience. Now you could go in to a table and do like control click and select multiple columns and change properties all at once. So it's a much faster way than having to click on each one individually to change these. And I think this is one of the properties you could change for multiple columns at a time.
And you don't often count those?
The integers, you're going to be counting the rows off of the tables.
Okay.
Right.
They should be the same. Okay. So you're typically doing count rows. I mean, if I'm creating a visual, that would be the thing that I pull in. Like, let's say it's just a table, it's counting the number of whatevers. Mm-hmm. I would just pull the key in and count it as the value. So what would you do there?
So historically, count, distinct count, things like that are slow in the engine. So there's a couple techniques that I end up using.
Oh, you define a measure, you define it as count rows, and you pull the measure in.
Well, well, even the count rows inside a measure could be slow, right?
Oh, okay.
So what you could do is you could do a sum X, right? And you provide a table, which are the values of what you're looking to count. And then the value that you're going to sum is just the value of 1. That's a way of doing it. There's an old school technique, right? And that one is probably the best way. I still sometimes carry over the old school technique because a lot of times what we used to do is just put a column in the table that helped us with counting, and every row had the value of 1 in it. And then we just did a sum of that row, and that would do the same thing, right? That would give us the count.
I get why distinct count is slow. I mean, why would count be slow? It seems like it's something they could easily optimize for, because like you just explained it, right? You're just adding 1 to everything.
Yeah. Well, whoever the person was that did it at the time, and they don't have time to go back and refactor it. They'd rather do new features. So.
Okay. Yeah. I get it. It's just funny because, like, I get why distinct has to be slow, or not has to be, but but this I don't understand.
An intern developed that, where a senior person developed some X. I don't know. I mean,
I don't know. So make a call for interns of the world to unite.
Some interns are very good. I've seen things come out that said an intern built this function in there, or this functionality.
I think I did my best work as an intern. It's been all downhill since then.
Yeah. So, well, okay. So reverse it. An intern did some X, and then some senior person did count, and they got lazy because they had too much other stuff to do. It's possible too. But yeah, I do recommend setting all of your default summarizations. Like here, it's talking about year, right? Year is going to end up being numeric, but you're never really summarizing it, right? So turn it off. That's going to help in your model. And also what it helps with is when you bring it over onto a visual, it's going to try to add it to one of the axes rather than to the values, right? Because if it brings it over and it has a default, a way to become an implicit measure, it's going to add it to the values, and then you're changing things around. It's really a best practice to set everything to none, and then anything that you want measures put for you, you build the explicit measures. That's the best way. And it's called avoiding implicit measures altogether. We kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, right? Calculated columns, right? Push it back as far as possible, because each column that you do as a calculated column is going to take up RAM. If you could, especially if they're helper columns that they're not really being used in the report, but they're used to build other things, try to move that back into the M code. Right. So like the case that we talked about with that opportunity, the ID being a GUID, once you produce that surrogate key, you don't need that GUID anywhere inside your code. You shouldn't. You might leave it in your model a little bit early to help you debug and connect back to the data. But once you're kind of confident on the model, that ID, that long string could be totally removed from it. But in the transformation logic, it's a helper column to help you move that surrogate key to multiple tables. If you do need to create a calculated column, try to put it onto a dimension table rather than the fact table, right? Because the fact tables, should have more rows on it.
Is there a scenario where you had to build the calculated column in the front end and you couldn't do it in that? Like, why would you need to do it? I'm just trying to understand, I guess, what it would be doing.
You're talking as a calculated column in.
Yeah, like let's say something, and I was doing it as a calculated column in Power BI because I can't do it in M. Is that possible? I can't imagine what you couldn't do.
It's I wouldn't say it's impossible, but there is cases where the amount of logic that you'd have to put in the M code.
Oh, because you have, yeah,
and it could perform longer. So let's say, for example, what you want to do is just keep on a product what the lifetime sales of a particular product is, right? And you're going to actually keep that or build a bucket, say, on your product table for it. Well, for you to go through in the M code row by row and add everything up, row by row, product by product, that could take a long time. But once it's up kind of in the model and things are built in, to just say, I'm going to do a calculated column that is total sales, and that's going to produce me a column that's on my product table, that calculated column in DAX is going to perform extremely fast, right? And it could be useful, right? So there are reasons to use calculated columns. Again, you just got to kind of weigh what's better for the solution that you're trying to come up with.
Okay.
Okay,
that kind of blows it. Like I would never have realized that is a lot faster to do in Power BI than to do it in Power Query.
I'm saying it could be.
Okay.
It's another one of those consultant answers of everything is it depends. And for a data model that I have, it could be faster. For a data model that you have, it could be slower, right? It all depends on everything else that is all put together behind it.
When you do the performance analyzer in Power BI and you have it, right, you turn it on and it's watching. I'm trying to think, it does the whole Power Query refresh. Like if you do a refresh and it's going back to data sources, so are you getting measurements on everything in the Power Query operations plus the Power BI?
I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. When there's the window that's called Performance Analyzer in Power BI Desktop is analyzing the performance of the visuals on that page.
Right. It's just only refreshing the visuals. So if you do a refresh on the data, is that can you get performance statistics on that? So you
So
could,
Phil Seamark, I think that's how you say his last name. He put together a nice tool to help you see that. And what you do is you turn on what's called, he shows you exactly how to do this. You turn extended events on the model, you do the refresh, and it'll capture that data using SQL Profiler. And then he feeds that data into a Power BI template, and he'll show you exactly where you're having problems on the, but no, there's not a good way to see that from the Power BI desktop tool. But I could send that link to everybody. It's a great, he's updated it just recently as well. But I've used it a couple times to figure out what I want to focus on improving the refresh of the model.
thanks.
I think we talked a little bit about this over our the time that we've done this course, because this reminds me of the if.eager that's out now, right? And this was kind of one of the scenarios that the if.eager was looking to address. But I would probably still use this technique. This is talking about using variables to help improve your speed when you have repeating values within your measure. So this should have been highlighted blue as well. So you're going to have a variable that's total rows that's going to be your measure, and it's stored in there, and then it's used in these two parts of this calculation. So in this calculation here, it's going to calculate this 2 times. Here, it's only going to calculate it once for this variable and then use that value in this ratio.
Isn't this something that, like, I don't know, in the next 5 years they could optimize? Like, really?
Well, that's what I'm saying is the if.eager is what they've optimized it with now. But that if.eager function doesn't perform faster and could possibly run slower in other cases. So remember, from a product company, Microsoft's #1 goal is to not to break things that are currently out there. So
I got no comment on that.
Well,
I got no comment.
It doesn't mean that they don't, but that's their goal, right? So that way they're saying is we don't want to change existing functionality, so they roll out a new function if.eager rather than change the if logic.
No, I get you. I was thinking, like, in a programming environment, sometimes you see a variable that's like in that situation, and the optimizer can recognize that and say, oh, that's the same thing twice. Let me pull that out, save it, or cache it. Basically exactly what was done there. And so I mean, the tool that's the parser that's or the analyzer that's looking at this can do that. I don't think it breaks the semantics. Like, I don't think you would get the wrong
but that's
result.
why they rolled it out the way they did. They discovered it does change it in some cases.
Well,
Believe me, they've done their testing. That's
because it's in an if, right?
Because the if function, right?
Right.
If they just change the if function to make it do this, they have found cases that it will break for some clients.
Yeah, no, I get you. If it weren't an if, if it were just a bunch of calculations and it weren't subject to that branching that the if gives, that it was going to compute everything, then maybe the optimizer would pick it up and be like, oh, you've got the same thing twice. Let me.
I kind of doubt it, right? That's why it's a best practice to use variables. Plus, variables helps your code be more readable. But this is one of the best practices.
Point taken,
yeah. So the next one is kind of the same type of thing, is use your divide function rather than the slash. And especially because people tend to do error checking, right? If you use a divide and it divides by 0, it's going to throw an error. So then you're doing you're using that if error function, and that causes the engine. I just read on this somewhere else. I didn't realize it, but it causes the engine to go into a total different mode so that it can detect the errors better, and that mode is slower. So it's better off to use this divide because it's just going to perform faster, right? It's again Microsoft communicating this is the better way to go. Oops, sorry. I read this 2 or 3 times today, and I wasn't 100% sure of what they were trying to get to, but you know, this is to me kind of the same type of thing. Is what they're saying is to use variables, right? So if you're calculating ratios and you want to do it efficiently, then you utilize variables. And it threw another thing here is in one of these methods, it's saying here in this method, if this returned blank, the blank would be filtered out. But in this method here, it would be it would return -1 and increase the query space. So
that is quite a subtlety to think about, like that, you know, you write these formulas and you think they're numbers and you're like, oh, but it might be blank. And
yeah.
and this just happened the other day. It's blank. It's not that it should be blank. It's just that in the visual I'm putting it in, it's going to end up having to take a blank in. Just something about the way the visual is. And I wasn't thinking that when I defined the measure. I didn't think it would ever be blank.
Yeah.
Because it shouldn't be the way I'm thinking about it. But I had to put in an if, you know, it was, I don't remember what it was, if something, and then make blank, otherwise do the logic. So I had to, I don't know if that was exactly the right way to do it, but the point is, like, you don't think you're going to have blanks, and you shouldn't really, except that you do, because of the way the visuals work.
That's a good straight man for this one, right?
Okay.
Actually, it was another slide I'm thinking of that's coming up a little bit. But what it's going to talk about is, instead of looking for blanks with the if statement, use the isBlank function rather than saying something is equal to blank, because you can get better performance out of it. But hopefully we'll hit that slide here soon. But inside your Power Query, don't replace values, you know, like empty values that that are blank. Don't change them to 0. The other reason I don't do that is you could actually come out, if you're doing things like averages or something like that, you could come out with a different average, and you might want to look at that, because if you change a number that is null within the data source and you change it to a 0, now that's going to get included in your average, to where when it was null, it won't get included in your average. And you could come out with a different average depending on your data set based upon that result.
I was just doing something with a line chart. If you had zeros, then where you have gaps, where you don't have like X values all the way from, you know, for along your X axis, you have gaps. So, because it might be a date dimension. And so you don't want it to drop to 0, your line chart. You just want it to connect the points, right? I mean, I think it would totally break that. You know what I'm saying?
On your line chart, look at setting contiguous versus categorical, and I think that'll change.
Okay,
that'll
I'll
help
look
you
at
out.
that. I'll look at that. Thank you.
Oh yeah, thank you.
So using the function SelectedValue, rather than some people will do, and I've been guilty of this. You'll check to see if there's only one value by using hasValue, and then you try to get what that actual value is by using values in that column name. Using SelectedValue is a much better function to use rather than those 2 steps. Plus, you could, if there's going to be a blank, you could also in SelectedValue tell it to what value to return instead of blank. So yeah, this will only return one value when it goes through. So again, it's just a little bit faster. This one kind of confused me, because it talks about SelectedValue here and selected values up top. So I was going to, hopefully if we have enough time, let me find the screen. I didn't know if selected values is even a function. Yeah, it's just selected value. There's not a selected values function. So this should say use selected value instead of values. I mean, I use values all the time to get the table return for the values that are in scope. So I'd have to dig.
Wait, so value, I'm confused. That line says values returns error in case it encounters multiple values.
Yeah, but it doesn't. That's why I was confused, because if I just do values, if I do value, that will return an error. I wonder if that's what they meant to say.
Maybe,
here.
yeah. Maybe that's where they switched where the S was. That's why they had an extra S up there and down there.
Yeah, because values returns a table. And so like I could come here and just say values of, nice. I could do that, and that's going to return me a table, and it's going to run. Oops.
By the way, it's hard to, we can't really make out, or I can't make out every single character.
Oh, and what I'm showing?
Yeah, like I can see its value, and I think I know.
Is that a little bit better?
A little bit. I thought that, yeah, okay. I don't know. Anyway, just keep going.
I just had a sense. See, so that, I mean, there's multiple things here, but if I change this to values or value, I know that's going to return an error. Yeah. So I have a feeling that they had this wrong, is use selected value instead of value, I think is the right statement here.
Makes sense.
So this is a little trick as well. And I know we only have like 3 minutes left. So we probably won't make it all the way through. So we'll yeah, we definitely won't. So we'll stop after this, and then we'll wrap up on the next meeting. So distinct and values does almost the same thing, but distinct does not return blank if blank is inside the data set due to integrity violations, where values will include blank. It's recommended to use values if you need to work with it instead of distinct. There's another good SQL BI blog post that talks about the difference between values and distinct. Throw that over into the chat real quick. Right, to kind of help you understand it. I tend to use values a lot more than I use distinct, unless I am trying to get rid of the blank row. Or if I just happen to be younger when I did it and I had bad code. All right, we're 1 minute past, or 1 minute till, so I'm going to pause here. We'll pick up at the next slide next time and make it through, and then just kind of go through the wrap up. And then that should be the end of this session. Is there any questions? I'm going to stop sharing, and I'll actually stop the recording. And then if there's questions on just about anything that you didn't want recorded,